She thought removing that quiet woman from first class would impress everyone on board. But she had no idea she was humiliating the one person who could expose everything they tried so hard to hide. The cabin lights glowed softly against polished leather seats, casting a golden reflection across the champagne glasses lined neatly on every tray table. First class was a world of its own. Tailored suits, designer handbags, quiet conversations spoken in low, confident tones. And then there was Claire Bennett. She sat near the window, her posture relaxed but composed, her hands folded gently over a simple cream-colored sweater that looked almost out of place among the luxury surrounding her. Her shoes were modest, her hair tied back in a loose, practical style, and her only accessory was a thin silver wedding band that caught the light just enough to be noticed, if anyone cared to look closely. But no one did. Not at first. A flight attendant paused a few rows ahead, her eyes scanning the cabin with practiced precision before landing on Claire. Vanessa Cole had worked first class for nearly 8 years, long enough to develop an instinct for who belonged and who didn't. It wasn't written in any manual, but it lived in the subtle language of posture, clothing, and confidence. And to her, Claire didn't match the picture. Vanessa approached slowly, her polite smile already forming, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice controlled, almost rehearsed. "May I see your boarding pass?" Claire looked up, surprised but calm, and handed it over without hesitation. Vanessa glanced down at the printed ticket, her smile tightening ever so slightly as she read the seat number. She checked it once, then again. Something in her expression shifted, not confusion, but doubt. Around them, a few passengers subtly turned their heads, drawn by the slight disruption in the otherwise perfect calm of the cabin. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper just enough to watch. A woman sipping sparkling water paused mid-sip. The air didn't change dramatically, but it thickened, just enough to be felt. Vanessa handed the ticket back slowly. "I see," she said, her tone still polite, but now edged with something colder. "There might be a small issue with your seating." Claire blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago," she replied gently, her voice steady, almost too calm for the tension beginning to ripple around her. Vanessa nodded, but her eyes flicked briefly over Claire's outfit again, as if searching for confirmation of a conclusion she had already reached. "Of course," she said, "but sometimes there are discrepancies. First class is typically reserved for premium passengers, and we just want to make sure everything is in order." The words were careful, professional, but the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. A faint murmur passed through the nearby seats, quickly silenced as passengers returned to their composed facades, though their attention never fully left. Claire sat there for a moment, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her boarding pass, her eyes steady, unreadable. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded once, as if she had heard this kind of tone before, somewhere, sometime, and knew exactly where it led. And in that quiet moment, as the engines hummed softly beneath the floor and the cabin remained suspended in polished stillness, something invisible shifted, because while Vanessa believed she was protecting the image of first class, she had just taken the first step toward unraveling it completely. The aisle fell silent. Vanessa did not move away this time, and the polite distance she had maintained a moment ago quietly disappeared as she stepped just a little closer to Claire's seat, her posture straighter, her tone now carrying a firmer edge beneath its professional surface. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to step out into the aisle while we verify this," she said, her hand gesturing lightly but decisively toward the narrow walkway between the rows. And for a brief second, Claire remained still, her fingers resting gently on the armrest, her eyes lifting to meet Vanessa's with a calm that felt almost out of place in a moment designed to unsettle her. "Is there a specific issue with my ticket?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, and that question, simple as it was, seemed to hang in the air longer than expected, drawing the attention of more passengers who now pretended not to look while listening closely. Vanessa gave a tight smile, the kind that was meant to reassure but instead created distance. "We just need to make sure everything aligns with our seating records," she replied, carefully avoiding any direct accusation while implying one all the same. Claire inhaled slowly, then unbuckled her seatbelt with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have. the small metallic snap echoing just enough to mark the moment as something more than routine. She stood up without resistance, stepping into the aisle as instructed, her movement unhurried, her composure intact. But the subtle shift in the room was undeniable now. Conversations had stopped entirely, and even those who had tried to ignore the situation found themselves drawn into its gravity. A man in a navy suit glanced over the rim of his glasses. A younger woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes flicking between Claire and Vanessa as if unsure where to look. The quiet hum of the engines filled the silence, but it no longer felt like background noise. It felt like tension. Vanessa took Claire's boarding pass again, this time holding it longer, examining it as though the paper itself might reveal something hidden. Then she turned slightly, signaling toward the front of the cabin where another attendant stood near the galley. "Mark," she called in a controlled voice. "Could you come here for a moment?" And within seconds, Mark Dalton approached, his expression neutral, his movements efficient, the kind of presence that suggested authority without needing to announce it. He looked at Claire briefly, then at Vanessa, and then at the boarding pass in her hand. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked quietly. And Vanessa leaned in just enough to lower her voice, though not enough to prevent nearby passengers from catching fragments of her words. "Seat assignment discrepancy," she said. "First class, but I am not entirely confident this is accurate." The phrasing was careful, but the implication was sharper now. Mark took the ticket, scanning it quickly, his brow tightening almost imperceptibly as he read the details. "This shows as confirmed," he said, his tone measured, but Vanessa did not step back. "I understand that," she replied, her voice now edged with quiet insistence. "But we need to consider the integrity of the cabin experience." And that phrase, spoken just loudly enough, carried weight, not because of what it said, but because of what it suggested. Claire stood there in the aisle, her hands now loosely clasped in front of her, her gaze steady, not defensive, not pleading, simply present, as if she were observing the situation rather than being consumed by it. And for a brief moment, Mark hesitated, his eyes shifting between the ticket and Claire, as though something did not quite align. But before that hesitation could settle into a decision, Vanessa spoke again, this time with finality masked as procedure. "We can reseat her in business class while we sort this out," she said, and the words landed with quiet force, because everyone in that cabin understood what they meant. It was not just about a seat. It was about belonging, about who was allowed to occupy this space without question and who was not. The aisle went still, the tension now fully visible in the stillness of every observer, and Claire, after a brief pause, gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the moment she had just been placed into. And as she took a single step forward, leaving behind the seat she had rightfully claimed, the silence deepened, heavier now, because something about what had just happened felt wrong, even to those who said nothing. Claire did not rush as she followed Mark down the narrow aisle. Each step measured, her shoulders relaxed, her expression composed in a way that made the moment feel even heavier than it already was. Because she was not reacting the way most people would. She was not arguing, not pleading, not even questioning further, and that quiet restraint seemed to unsettle the space around her more than any confrontation could have. Behind her, Vanessa remained standing near the vacated seat, her posture upright, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes lingered on Claire just a second too long, as if needing to reassure herself that the decision had been the correct one, the necessary one, the professional one, the kind that protected standards, preserved expectations, maintained order. And yet, something about the way the cabin had gone silent made that certainty feel thinner than before. Mark walked slightly ahead, glancing back once as if considering whether to say something, but he did not, because in environments like this, procedures often replaced empathy, and hesitation was something people learned to hide. They reached the curtain separating first class from the rest of the aircraft, and for a brief second, Claire paused, not dramatically, not in protest, but simply as if taking note of the invisible line she was being asked to cross. On one side, soft lighting, wide seats, quiet exclusivity. On the other, a different kind of order, still comfortable, still refined, but undeniably separate. And as the curtain shifted slightly with the airflow, Claire stepped through, the fabric brushing lightly against her shoulder. a small, almost symbolic motion that marked the transition. A flight attendant in business class looked up, her expression curious but cautious, clearly aware that something unusual was unfolding. "We have a reseating situation," Mark said briefly, his tone efficient, his words chosen to minimize attention while still explaining enough. The attendant nodded and gestured toward an empty seat near the middle of the cabin. "You can sit here for now," she said, her voice softer, less polished than Vanessa's, but more human in a way that did not go unnoticed. Claire gave a small nod of appreciation and stepped toward the seat, placing her bag gently beneath it before sitting down, her movements calm, deliberate, as though she were not being displaced, but simply adjusting to a minor inconvenience. But the truth of the moment lingered in the air around her, because everyone nearby had seen enough to understand that this was not just about logistics. A man seated across the aisle glanced at her briefly, then looked away quickly, his discomfort evident in the way he shifted in his seat. A woman a few rows ahead turned halfway around before catching herself and facing forward again, as if unsure whether witnessing the moment made her complicit in it. The quiet hum of the aircraft continued, but now it felt like a backdrop to something unresolved, something waiting, back in first class. Vanessa exhaled slowly, smoothing her uniform as she turned to address the remaining passengers, her smile returning. Controlled, practiced. "Thank you for your patience, everyone," she said, her voice light, as if nothing of consequence had just occurred, and a few passengers nodded politely, accepting the version of reality she offered, because it was easier that way, easier than questioning, easier than acknowledging, easier than wondering if something had just crossed a line that should not have been crossed. But even as the cabin attempted to return to its polished calm, there was a subtle shift that could not be undone, a lingering awareness that what had just happened did not quite sit right. And somewhere beyond the boarding door, at the edge of the jet bridge, a man in a tailored dark suit ended a phone call mid-sentence, his expression changing not because of what he heard, but because of what he saw, his gaze fixed through the open aircraft door, narrowing slightly as he took in the scene unfolding inside. And though no one in the cabin noticed him yet, the moment had already begun to turn, quietly, inevitably, like something long set in motion finally, reaching the point where it could no longer be ignored. And for the first time since Claire had been asked to stand, the silence carried something different, not just discomfort, but consequence. The man did not step onto the plane immediately, and that hesitation alone carried a kind of authority that did not need to be announced. Because while most passengers hurried to settle into their seats before departure, he stood at the threshold, his presence quiet but deliberate, his eyes scanning the cabin with a precision that suggested he was not just observing but assessing. And when his gaze shifted past the polished rows of first class and toward the slight movement behind the curtain, something in his expression hardened, not dramatically, not visibly to those inside, but enough to mark a change. Ethan Bennett had built his life on reading rooms exactly like this one, environments where everything appeared seamless on the surface, while something less visible moved underneath. And he recognized that tension instantly, the kind that lingered after a decision had been made too quickly or for the wrong reasons. He stepped forward at last, his shoes making a soft, measured sound against the aircraft floor, and as he entered first class, a few subtle reactions followed him without invitation. A glance from a passenger who recognized his face but could not quite place it, a slight straightening of posture from a flight attendant near the galley, the almost imperceptible shift in tone that happens when someone of influence enters a space that prides itself on exclusivity. Vanessa noticed him as he moved down the aisle, her professional smile returning with renewed focus, because people like him were the standard she understood, the kind of passenger who confirmed that her instincts about the cabin were correct. "Welcome aboard," she said smoothly, her voice warm now, her posture slightly more attentive, and Ethan gave a brief nod, polite but distant, his attention already moving past her. "Thank you," he replied, his tone calm, but there was no engagement in it, no small talk, no acknowledgement beyond necessity, and that alone created a subtle pause in her rhythm, because she was used to being seen, to being part of the experience, not simply part of the background. He continued forward, his eyes moving once more toward the curtain, and this time he did not hesitate. He reached out and pulled it aside just enough to step through. The motion simple, unremarkable to most. But to Vanessa, it felt like a break in the controlled flow of the cabin, something slightly out of sequence. Mark noticed it too from his position near the front, his gaze following Ethan with a flicker of uncertainty that he quickly masked. In business class, Claire sat quietly, her gaze directed toward the window, though she was not really looking at anything beyond it, her reflection. Faintly visible in the glass, composed, still, unchanged, as if the previous moments had settled into her without leaving a visible mark. And then she sensed it, not a sound, not a movement, but a presence, the kind that shifts the air before a word is spoken. She turned slightly, her eyes lifting, and there he was, standing just a few feet away in the aisle, his expression unreadable at first, his posture calm but unmistakably focused. The distance between them felt longer than it was, filled with everything that had just happened and everything that had not yet been said. Ethan did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her, taking in the seat, the position, the context, the quiet around her that did not belong to a routine seating change. And then his gaze shifted briefly, scanning the surrounding passengers, the subtle discomfort, the avoided eye contact, the silence that carried more than it should. He understood enough without needing explanation, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but it carried through the space with a clarity that cut through the hum of the cabin. "Claire," he said, and her name alone changed the atmosphere, because it was not a question, not a surprise, but a recognition, steady and certain. And as the few nearby passengers turned to look, something deeper began to unfold, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet inevitability of a moment that had just crossed from inconvenience into consequence. And somewhere behind them, in the polished calm of first class, Vanessa felt it before she fully understood it, that subtle shift again, the kind that does not announce itself, but once it arrives, everything after it changes. Ethan did not raise his voice, and that was what made it unmistakable, because in a space where authority was usually performed through politeness and scripted tone, his calm carried something heavier, something that did not need to be amplified to be understood. Claire met his eyes for a brief moment, her expression steady, and in that silence between them, everything that had just happened passed without words. She did not need to explain, and he did not need to ask. "Why are you sitting here?" he said finally, his voice low but precise, and the question was not directed at her alone. It extended outward, touching the space, the people, the decision itself. Claire tilted her head slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. "They said there was a discrepancy," she replied, her tone composed, almost neutral, but the choice of words was exact. It did not accuse, it did not dramatize. It simply placed the moment where it belonged, and that made it harder to dismiss. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand. Then his gaze shifted beyond her, sweeping across the nearby seats, taking in the subtle tension, the way passengers avoided direct eye contact while still listening, the way the atmosphere felt suspended, unfinished. He turned slightly toward the aisle, his posture straightening just enough to signal a shift, not in emotion, but in direction. "Who made that determination?" he asked, his voice carrying further now, not louder, but clearer, and that question traveled quickly, moving past the few rows of business class and into the edge of first class where Vanessa stood, still composed, still holding the image she had carefully maintained. But something in her expression tightened, because the tone of that question was different from anything she had encountered so far. It was not uncertain. It was not seeking clarification. It was establishing a line. Mark stepped forward almost immediately, his instinct to manage the situation overriding the hesitation that had lingered earlier. "Sir, there was a seating verification process," he began, his words measured, professional, but lacking the certainty they might have carried before. Ethan turned his attention to him, his gaze steady, unhurried. "Verification implies uncertainty," he said calmly. "So I will ask again. Who decided she did not belong in the seat she paid for?" The phrasing landed with quiet force, and for the first time since the situation began, the underlying assumption was spoken without disguise. The word belong hung in the air longer than any technical explanation could cover. Vanessa stepped forward then, her Composure still intact, but thinner now. I made the call based on standard cabin protocol, she said, her tone controlled, though a slight edge had crept in, as if she needed to reassert the authority she had relied on just moments ago. Ethan looked at her, not dismissively, not aggressively, but with a focus that made the space around them feel smaller, more precise. Standard protocol, he repeated, and there was no mockery in his voice, only examination. Does your protocol usually involve removing a confirmed first-class passenger without cause? Vanessa held her posture, but the certainty in her expression began to shift, just enough to be noticed by those watching closely. There were inconsistencies, she replied, and again, the word was careful, chosen to avoid specifics while implying justification. Ethan nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the answer, but not accepting it. Then let us resolve those inconsistencies, he said, his tone still even. Because from where I am standing, the only inconsistency is why my wife is no longer in her seat. And that single word changed everything. Not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. A ripple moved through the nearby rows, subtle but immediate, heads turning more openly now, eyes no longer pretending not to see. The context had shifted in an instant, and with it, the balance of the moment. Mark's expression tightened as he processed the implication. Vanessa's composure flickered for the first time, just a fraction, but enough, and Claire remained seated, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet but now unmistakably central, as if the entire cabin had finally aligned around the truth that had been overlooked from the beginning. And in that suspended silence, where no one moved and no one spoke, the realization began to settle, not just for the crew, but for everyone watching, that what had been dismissed as a minor adjustment was no longer small, no longer procedural. It had become something else entirely, something that could not be undone simply by returning a seat. And for the first time since the aisle had fallen silent, the air carried not just tension, but consequence. No one spoke. Immediately after that word settled into the air, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy, deliberate, the kind of silence that forms when something undeniable has just been revealed. Vanessa stood still, her posture still upright, her hands composed. But the control she had relied on moments ago now felt fragile, because the situation had shifted beyond protocol, beyond routine, beyond anything she could redirect with a practiced smile. Mark cleared his throat, quietly, stepping slightly forward as if to regain structure. Sir, if there has been a misunderstanding, we can certainly correct the seating arrangement, he said, his tone careful, attempting to restore balance without fully addressing what had just been exposed. But Ethan did not move, his gaze steady, his presence anchoring the moment in place. This is not about correcting a seat, he replied calmly, and his voice carried further now, not louder, but sharper in its clarity. This is about how the decision was made in the first place. The words landed without aggression, but they carried weight that could not be softened. A few passengers shifted in their seats, no longer pretending to be uninvolved, because the conversation had moved from a private inconvenience to something public, something that reflected on the entire space. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her composure tightening again as she stepped forward, attempting to reframe the moment. Our responsibility is to maintain the integrity of the first-class experience, she said, her tone measured, but now there was a slight strain beneath it, as if the phrase no longer held the same certainty it once did. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. Integrity is not maintained by excluding someone who meets every requirement, he said, his voice even. It is maintained by applying your standards consistently, without assumption. The word assumption lingered, quiet but unmistakable, and for the first time, Vanessa did not respond immediately, because there was no simple way to redefine what had already been implied. Claire remained seated, her posture calm, her presence steady, but now there was a subtle shift in her expression, not relief, not satisfaction, but something quieter, something more resolved, as if she had reached the point where silence was no longer necessary. She looked up slightly, her voice soft but clear as she spoke. I showed my boarding pass twice, she said, and though her tone carried no accusation, the simplicity of the statement made it heavier than any confrontation could have been. It was confirmed both times, she added, and then she let the words settle. Not expanding, not defending, just allowing the truth to stand on its own. Mark glanced at Vanessa briefly, then back at Ethan, the tension between procedure and reality now impossible to ignore. We can escort Mrs. Bennet back to her original seat immediately, he offered, his voice more direct now, as if trying to close the situation before it expanded further, but Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at Claire, giving her the space to respond, and in that moment, the dynamic shifted again, because the resolution was no longer his to dictate. Claire held his gaze for a brief second, then looked toward Mark, her expression composed. I will return to my seat, she said quietly, but I would like to understand why I had to leave it in the first place. Her words were measured, respectful, but firm, and they carried something deeper than the situation itself. They carried the question that no one had wanted to ask out loud. Why her? Why now? Why without cause? And once spoken, that question settled into the cabin with a weight that could not be dismissed. Vanessa's composure faltered again, just slightly, her confidence now caught between defending her decision and acknowledging its flaw. The polished calm of first class had begun to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that truth often does. And as the engines hummed steadily beneath them, the space that had once felt controlled and exclusive now felt exposed, not by force, but by clarity. And in that moment, every person present understood that what happened next would not just restore a seat, it would define what that space truly stood for. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but no. Words came immediately, and that hesitation, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything she could have said, because for the first time since the situation began, she was no longer directing it. She was inside it, and everyone could see it. Mark shifted slightly beside her, his usual confidence replaced by something more cautious, more aware, as if he understood that this moment was no longer about procedure. It was about accountability. Mrs. Bennet, your seat is fully confirmed, he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before, and the admission, simple and direct, landed with a clarity that made the earlier justification feel hollow. A ripple of subtle reactions moved through the cabin, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. A man near the aisle leaned back slowly, his expression tightening. A woman across from Claire lowered her gaze, her earlier curiosity now replaced by discomfort. The room was no longer observing a situation, it was witnessing a mistake unfold in real time. Ethan did not interrupt, he did not press further, he simply allowed the truth to settle, and in doing so, he made it impossible to ignore. Vanessa straightened slightly, drawing in a controlled breath, attempting to recover the authority that had defined her just moments ago. Then we will escort her back immediately, she said, her tone firm again, but now it lacked the quiet certainty it once held. It sounded practiced, not assured, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Claire rose from her seat without urgency, her movements calm, her posture unchanged, but there was something different now, not in how she carried herself, but in how the space responded to her. The same aisle that had felt narrow and isolating minutes ago now seemed to open around her, not physically, but in perception, in recognition, as if the room itself had shifted its understanding of who she was, and more importantly, who she had always been. She stepped forward, moving past Ethan briefly, and as she did, he gave a small nod, not of permission, but of acknowledgement, the kind shared between two people who understood each other without needing explanation. As they approached the curtain, Mark moved ahead to clear the path, his actions efficient but noticeably more attentive now. The boundary between cabins no longer felt like a line of exclusion, but a passage back to something that should never have been taken. Vanessa followed a step behind, her presence quieter, her earlier confidence replaced by a controlled restraint that bordered on unease. And when they reached Claire's original seat, it remained exactly as she had left it, untouched, waiting, a silent reminder that nothing had ever been wrong with it, only with the decision that removed her from it. Claire paused for a fraction of a second before sitting down, her hand brushing lightly against the armrest, reclaiming the space not with force, but with quiet certainty. The act itself simple, but the meaning behind it unmistakable. The surrounding passengers did not speak, but their attention was no longer hidden. It was direct now, present, reflective, as if each of them was processing the same realization at once, that what had happened was not just an error, but a reflection of something deeper, something uncomfortable. Ethan remained standing in the aisle for a moment longer, his gaze moving briefly across the cabin, not searching, not judging, but observing. And in that observation, there was a silent message, one that did not need to be spoken to be understood, that spaces like this are not defined by who is allowed in, but by how those within them choose to treat others. And as he finally took his seat beside Claire, the cabin settled once more into silence. But it was no longer the same silence as before. It was heavier, more aware, the kind that follows a truth that cannot be undone. And though no announcement was made, no formal acknowledgement given, everyone present understood that something had shifted, something that would remain long after the flight had taken off. And in that stillness, Vanessa stood for a moment longer than necessary before turning away, her composure intact, but her certainty gone, because for the first time, she was no longer sure she had protected the integrity of the cabin. She had revealed something else entirely, and the room, in its quiet, had seen it. The cabin did not return to normal, even as people adjusted in their seats and the soft routines of pre-departure resumed, because something unseen had already changed, something that could not be undone by polite smiles or quiet service. Claire sat still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze forward, not claiming attention, not seeking validation, but no longer invisible in the way she had been before. And that difference settled into the space like a quiet truth. Ethan leaned slightly back in his seat beside her, his posture relaxed, but his presence still carried the weight of what had just unfolded, not because he had raised his voice, but because he had not needed to. And that restraint had done more than any confrontation could have. Across the aisle, a man who had earlier avoided looking at Claire now glanced over again. But this time there was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet recognition. The kind that comes too late, but still arrives. A woman, a few rows ahead, adjusted her scarf slowly, her eyes lingering for a second before turning forward again, as if processing something she had not expected to confront. Near the galley, Vanessa stood with her back partially turned, reviewing something on her tablet, her movements precise, controlled, but just slightly slower than before, as though she were measuring each action more carefully now. Aware that every gesture carried meaning beyond routine, Mark approached her quietly, speaking in a low voice that did not carry far. But the exchange between them was brief, and whatever was said did not restore what had been lost, because the issue was no longer operational. It was visible, undeniable, and shared by everyone who had witnessed it. A moment later, Vanessa stepped forward again, her expression composed, though softer now, less certain. She walked toward Claire's seat, her steps measured, her tone prepared. But this time, when she spoke, the words carried something different, not authority, not control, but acknowledgement. "Mrs. Bennet," she said quietly, her voice respectful, no longer edged with assumption, "I want to apologize for the inconvenience earlier." The phrasing was careful, still professional, but it did not fully match the weight of what had occurred. And for a brief second, the air seemed to hold its breath, because everyone understood that this was the moment where something deeper could be said, or left unsaid. Claire turned her head slightly, her expression calm, her eyes steady. She listened without interruption, without reaction, allowing the words to exist as they were, and then she spoke. Her voice soft, but clear enough to carry through the surrounding seats. "It was not an inconvenience," she said gently, and the correction, simple as it was, shifted the meaning of everything that followed. Vanessa's composure faltered just slightly, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those closest to notice. Claire continued, her tone unchanged. "It was a decision," she added, and the words settled with quiet precision, not confrontational, not emotional, but undeniable. She did not raise her voice. She did not expand further. She simply allowed the truth to stand. And in that moment, the apology that had been offered felt incomplete, not because it was insincere, but because it did not reach the depth of what had happened. Ethan remained silent beside her, his gaze forward, allowing her voice to define the moment. Because this was not his to lead, it was hers. Vanessa nodded slowly, her expression shifting, not defensive now, but reflective, as if she understood, perhaps too late, that what she had relied on as instinct had revealed something else entirely, something she could not easily explain away. "I understand," she said quietly, though it was not clear whether she truly did. And after a brief pause, she stepped back, returning to her duties, but with a presence that felt different, more careful, more aware. The cabin remained silent, but it was no longer tense, it was contemplative. The kind of silence that follows a moment that has reshaped perception. And as the plane prepared for departure, the polished image of first class still remained. The seats, the lighting, the service, all unchanged. But beneath it, something had shifted, something that could not be unseen, and though no announcement would ever acknowledge it, everyone there carried it with them. The quiet realization that dignity is not granted by a seat, but revealed in how easily it can be taken and how firmly it can be reclaimed. The aircraft doors closed with a soft, final sound that echoed faintly through the cabin, and as the engines began to build a steady hum beneath the floor, the world outside slowly started to fade. But inside, the weight of what had happened remained, not loud, not disruptive, but present in a way that could not be ignored. Claire sat quietly, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward as the plane began to move. The runway stretching ahead in long, bright lines, and for a moment, everything looked exactly as it should, polished, controlled, effortless. But that illusion no longer held the same meaning, because everyone on board had seen how easily it could fracture. Ethan glanced toward her briefly, not to check, not to reassure, but simply to acknowledge, and she returned the look with a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that carried understanding without needing explanation. Around them, passengers settled into their seats again, adjusting their trays, their blankets, their attention, but something in their movements had softened, as if each of them had become more aware of the space they occupied and the people within it. A man who had earlier hidden behind his newspaper now folded it neatly and set it aside, his expression thoughtful rather than distant. A woman across the aisle exhaled slowly, her gaze lingering for a second before turning toward the window, not avoiding, but reflecting. The quiet hum of the engines grew stronger as the plane accelerated. And then, with a smooth lift, the ground fell away beneath them, the city shrinking into distant shapes and lines, and still, the silence inside remained, not tense, not uncomfortable, but heavy with something unspoken. Vanessa moved through the aisle again, her service precise, her tone softer, more deliberate, and though she spoke the same words she always did, offering drinks, adjusting trays, checking seatbelts, there was a difference now, subtle but unmistakable. She looked at each passenger more directly, her attention more present, as if something in her understanding had shifted, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to be noticed. When she reached Claire's row, she paused for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, not to speak, not to explain, but simply to acknowledge, and then she moved on, her steps steady, her composure restored, but changed, because once a moment like that happens, it does not disappear, it becomes part of everything that follows. Mark remained near the front of the cabin, his posture professional, but his earlier confidence now tempered with a quiet awareness, the kind that comes from seeing a situation unfold beyond control and realizing that some things cannot be managed through procedure alone. Claire leaned back slightly in her seat as the plane leveled out, the soft glow of the cabin lights reflecting faintly in her eyes, and for the first time since the moment began, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not relief, not victory, but something deeper, something quieter, the steady presence of someone who had not needed to prove her worth, only to remain in it. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the armrests, his gaze forward, no longer engaged with the situation, because it had already resolved itself in the only way that mattered, not through authority, not through power, but through clarity, and in that clarity, something had been revealed, not just about Claire, but about everyone who had witnessed it. The cabin settled fully into its rhythm as the flight continued, the gentle sounds of service, the occasional murmur of conversation, the soft clink of glass against tray, all returning as if nothing had happened. But beneath that surface, The memory remained quiet, steady, undeniable, because on that flight, in that polished space where everything was designed to feel exclusive and controlled, something far more important had been exposed, not in a dramatic display, not through confrontation, but through a simple moment of truth. And though the plane carried them forward across miles of sky, that moment stayed with them, a silent reminder that respect is not defined by where you sit, but by how you treat the person you believe matters least. And on that day, in that quiet cabin above the clouds, everyone learned exactly what dignity looks like.